Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're doing day 5 loops in C++. And in this task, we'll be exploring given an integer n, print the first 10 multiples of this integer. So each multiple is n multiplied by I, where I is a range of numbers from 1 to 10. And this should be printed on a new line in the form n times I equals to result. So as you can see, the only difference within each execution is just I itself. And how we can easily replicate this multiple times is by using for loops. Within for loops, we can define an integer which we would like it to be used during the for loop execution. And we can increment this I in this for loop after every iteration. We will then specify a condition for the for loop to stop. And in this case, we will just be using a simple condition where I is less than equals to 10. So if I is suddenly 11, then the for loop will know that it should terminate, and that's pretty much it. So with that, let's get started. For this task, as usual, HackerRank gave us the boilerplate to read in the input n from the sample input. And in this case, they use the same strategy as we discussed in previous exercises. So to be specific, we define a string temporary variable called n_temp, and we read in the input from the sample input using getLine. And similarly, we do a left trim and a right trim on this temporary n string to remove the white spaces on the left and right and convert this into an integer. So now that we get that out of the way and understand how we can read in the input from the question input, now we can get started with using this for loop to print out these lines of multiples of n. So with that, the for loop syntax looks like this. And there are 3 parts to the for loop over here. Each part of the for loop is separated by semicolons. And the first part of the for loop is where we define a single integer that we can use for the for loop. So in this case, let I equals to 1 because we want to print I from 1 to 10. So let us assign I to 1 and we'll be using this I for getting the multiples of n in a bit. The second part of the for loop is to specify the condition that the for loop will follow to run the code that is on line 18. So if this condition is met, then it will continue to iterate. So in this case, the condition that we want is when I is less than equals to 10. So if I is less than equals to 10, the for loop will continue to execute whatever snippet that is wrapped within these curly braces. And finally, the final part of the for loop is to give instructions for what to do with I after every iteration of the for loop. So in this case, after we print out 3 times 1 equal to 3, we would want to increment I so that we can start to print 3 times 2 in the next iteration. So in this case, let's do I++. What this means is that after every iteration of the for loop, increment the I by 1 before starting the next iteration. If you were wondering how we can do the increment before we execute line 18, you can do ++i, but if that's the case, you want to set I to be equals to 0 because we want to print the multiples from 1 to 10. So understandably, if you want to use I equals to 0, then we will need to increment I before we execute the iteration. But that's just for completeness. Let's set this back to what we chose. So with that, we can start printing out the lines as we like. So now, the first thing that we're going to print is the n itself. So let's do n over here. And in this case, we can concatenate this with a multiplication string over here with 2 spaces and add this with I. But notice that in this case, you can see that we have C++ complaining because we are adding an integer with a string. So before we do the string concatenation, we have to convert n together with I to a string first. So we can do that using this function toString that is within the string library. And this is imported with this huge import that pretty much imports all helpful functions from all the C++ libraries. So we will do the same for I. I is an integer as well. And in this case, we will concatenate this with equals followed by the product of I and n. And let's end that with an end line as well. So with that, this is pretty much how we will solve this question using string concatenation and a for loop. So let's submit this code. And that's pretty much it. So for this exercise, we went through how we can use a for loop, the anatomy of a for loop, and how we can use this for loop to solve this question. To be specific, how do we use a for loop to iterate 10 times of the printing to the console, and how we can use string concatenation to format our output accordingly to what the question wants us to do. And with that, that's pretty much the end of this demonstration. I hope this was of value to you, and if it was, please give us a like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next video.